The films E.T., The Extraterrestrial, and 2001, A Space Odyssey, I think they both have common themes of discussing, like, space, but they both also have in similar sort of uses of myth and ritual, and both of them, myth and ritual and the idea of myth ritualism going hand in hand to enforce the norms of society, which is largely inspired by Bronislaw Malinowski's theories on myth ritualism. And both the films, obviously, have discussions around what is alien to us, hence the term like alien, and this construct of the other in relation to human existence. And on the same hand, they also ask questions of like what makes us human, if there's life beyond us, and how are we different from them. So one of the things that's characteristic of both of the films is costumes and use of special effects to really like immersify you in the experience that you're looking at something that isn't recognizably human bodies. Because human bodies, as we understand them, are recognizable with having some kind of form with like legs and arms and a head. Although even that sort of image of a human depends on the human you're talking to. Some people don't have legs. So that it's a way to identify humans, but this can also be veiled, which is a tool that's used in E.T. because E.T. is recognizably, arguably not human, being a very stout, wrinkled, and unfamiliar like shape. And this indicator of him not being human is veiled in the film on Halloween, when humans sort of give themselves a pass to present as not human, to present as the other. And his presence in the film isn't questioned because he's covered in a tarp that sort of masks his identity. And the body and this idea of form is something that we recognize and respect as a society. And it's one of the things that like sets apart things as other, which also crosses into A Space Odyssey with the ideas of aliens and AI life, because these corporeal forms don't necessarily have human bodies in the way we understand them. Like the monolith, which could arguably be like the alien of the film, doesn't actually have a body. It's a slab. And Hal, which is, sort of this manifestation of artificial intelligence, is a computer system. And although he exhibits, empathy and connection in a manner very similar to humans, its like physical form is a computer system that sort of resembles like an eye. So it gives you that feeling that you're looking at something like familiar to or reminiscent of a human being. And, sort of that idea of empathy and connection is one of those characteristics that as a society we kind of chalk humans up to being specifically human, like those characteristics. And that's something that we see displayed in E.T. in particular too, because we see that this being is separate and different, but you realize throughout the film that he's sort of humanized in the sense of seeing that it's clearly intelligent and empathetic and connects to things, and especially in his the Elliot identifies E.T. as a like male, his connection to Elliot like mentally through a bond, and having magical abilities to physically bond with Elliot and feel his pain, and the ability to heal human beings. It's something that humans can't seem to just intrinsically do. So throughout the film, we sort of see E.T. learn how to communicate with humans. Although E.T. is seen as other, E.T. learns language in a manner very similar to children, toddlers learning how to talk by watching a TV. He learns to talk to the humans in the movie. So it sort of begs the question of like, if E.T. can do it, then how is E.T. not human? So it's very interesting, sort of the things that we chalk up to only humans being capable of doing. And that's something that Hal also does. Hal is able to converse with the characters in the film. The entity itself says it can feel, and that it sees, because it asks Dave to see Dave's drawings, and you can almost see with the use of the lens through Hal's perspective. And its ability to connect and feel sort of makes you, the viewer, feel for Hal. And when its ultimate purpose is revealed, that there's it's supposed to bring the humans to space, it sort of asks that question is like, well, was it all just a ploy? Like, were any of its emotions real? And it's especially painful when you see HAL being rebooted because it seems to mimic human behavior in pleading for its life. And then ultimately, when Dave is resetting the sort of like database and deleting its memories, myth sort of surfaces in the form of an origin story of HAL resetting and explaining and remembering when it was first sort of like born or created, and sings the first song it had ever heard. And so, although it's made clear that HAL doesn't have a body in the same way that we see a human body and recognize humans, you feel sadness, and Dave clearly feels sadness when he's trying to sort of destroy HAL. And it's such an interesting thing about like what makes us, an interesting question about what makes us human, and that sort of cycles back to E.T. with the ideas of violence, because in Space Odyssey, like the HAL murders the human beings to ensure that the plan succeeds, and it seems to be like a means of finishing the plan. And in E.T., when the children first hear from Elliot that there seems to be something in the back of the woods back in their backyard that they don't know, they grab a kitchen knife as if to attack whatever it is, which is such an intense action for children. And this is this sort of theme of protecting life, even if it's not human, on a different end than, wielding a knife to destroy life. Elliot frees the sort of contained frogs that they were going to dissect for science in class. And again, the themes of life and science and sort of distinctions of what makes us human cycles back again to Space Odyssey, because the thing, or the human beings that HAL murders, were in hibernation, where it's explained that they can't even dream and that they barely breathe. So does that really qualify as life if so much of their living is just them stuck? I mean, obviously they could wake up when going through the proper protocols, but it's such an interesting thing about what being alive means and what's natural. And both of the films sort of interact with space and Earth and the idea of nature, in the sense of like what is inherent to the planet or to our understanding of reality. So the landscape of Earth, the natural greenery of Earth, is whatever our idea of natural is. And human development is something that we've seen. Is it natural? Like, is it natural that the apes were able to like discover how to use bones to destroy and attack other apes? Or was the introduction of the monolith and the apes touching that sort of the instigator for them figuring out how to do things? Like, is that natural? Is human developed natural? I'm gonna keep saying it's interesting because there's so many thoughts in both of the films, and they both sort of arise that question of, with E.T. and the scientists wanting to save its life, but ultimately, if E.T. dies, going to enact experiments upon it to sort of understand how it works. And both of the films use visually that stark colorfulness of space. I mean, even with the black void that you think space is, there's so many colors of greens and blues near the end of the film. And in juxtaposition, both of these films, because E.T. has like the greenery of nature, when you introduce science and human development, it seems to be starkly white and devoid of life, for the fact that the base of the moon, or the base on the moon in Space Odyssey, is literally built into space, into the moon, and it seems like a way of tearing apart the natural structure of and colonializing the moon, which is just so strange. That idea of like, is it natural of us to do that to something that existed before us? And music also plays an important element in both films, as like setting that tone of unease and wonder. And both of the films ask questions of sort of like disobedience, like what does it mean to not follow the rules that are set by society, especially around science, which again is Malinowski's sort of theory about myth, because myth sort of operates under setting the foundation of what these rules are. With E.T. and A Space Odyssey, myth kind of serves as that unspoken, like, precedent of rules. The children in the film are young and not as set in their ways as the adults in the film. There's literally a scene where the mother is in the same room as E.T. and doesn't notice E.T. in the room, and I think that kind of speaks to how lost she was in day-to-day life and trying to keep her kids alive and well, that she didn't even notice an extraterrestrial being literally sitting in her kitchen. And it seems that the children in the film are sort of learning morals and what's right or wrong with protecting E.T.'s life. And myths, when they are referenced in the film verbally, are kind of connotated to that of like fairy tales of falsehood, like mentioning the alligators in the sewer thing when they believe that Elliot is just seeing things. And myths are also kind of present, that idea of like the norms that you teach society are even present in TV, which is how E.T. sort of learns more customs and language similar to a child, which follows Gertie, I believe is the name of the toddler in the movie, and she helps E.T. learn language in the same way that they learn from the TV. So it's interesting how, even with all of that sort of discussion of myth, the myth of E.T. and its people is not explained. It's never really explained, and it's the same for A Space Odyssey. The origin of the monolith is very clearly not explained. It's explicitly stated that where it came from and what it does is not, humanity doesn't know. And it's interesting how even the monolith doesn't sort of conform to human rules. You can't tell if there's multiple versions of the monolith throughout the film, because we see it at least 3 different points, and whether or not it can just fly through space, if it can teleport, if it's actually an alien, then it doesn't seem to have sort of a body in the way that we recognize bodies, and it doesn't really conform to like ideas of gravity in that shot where it's sort of drifting through space. So it's kind of unclear whether or not it sort of aligns to our rules, and the mythology of like our rules around like gravity and that things have to be grounded to the earth. The monolith does not align to that. So that's kind of how myth arises in this film. And as far as ritual goes, ritual sort of supports the myth in enforcing the norms, and I think it sort of shows in the practice of science and human interaction. So for E.T., science is a way to sort of understand the vastness of space. And with E.T. specifically, the creature, when it dies, the scientists don't intend to return E.T.'s body to its people and be brought back to space. Or, well, you can't even really say people because they're not people in the way that we understand people. But they were going to study E.T. so they could kind of advance humanity and understand life beyond. And in A Space Odyssey, this is a whole universe built on the expansion of space, and they've sort of built rules. They reference them in passing, but they have rules constraining human behavior, which are mentioned as like the IAS conventions, the National Council of Astronauts. So these are sort of the myths, the rules that structure what society is like. And it's interesting how humans interact with each other in the film. There seems to be, with the benefits of technology, their interactions seem sparse. They barely talk to each other. And even when they do, there seems to be a very like set up system of response and answers. It just seems very dry. It seems very lonely, especially for the people who are out in space, virtually by themselves. The fact that Dave, our main character by the end, is completely by himself, and like, especially at the end of the film where you have that sort of direct intervention of God and magic in the movie, because it just goes completely off the rockers. He seems to age very quickly in that sort of room that doesn't seem like it should exist on this other planet. And then the monolith appears out of nowhere, and then his body is gone, and there's just a fetus. So it's kind of that idea of what even happened there. And I think it sort of speaks to Gilbert Murray's idea of anagnorisis, with, I think, and I recognizing God, the alien is sort of God to him in that sense. And the response of just reaching to touch it, and then he sort of disappears and there's just a fetus. And I think there are sort of different ways to read the ending of that movie. And I think in one way, it is definitely a death and rebirth, because Dave is gone, but that fetus is there. So it could potentially be that the death of Dave and sort of the regeneration of this baby, which would revert from old age to young age, is the creation of a vessel for this alien that we have earlier in the film that's basically just a monolith. And it's sort of that God inhabiting the body. I That's just one way of interpreting the ending. And circling back to a more clearly defined ending with E.T. is that the sort of idea of the intervention of the god and like magic in the film, what with E.T. having like powers to heal and to levitate things. Both of the films sort of have the idea of, I think it's pronounced hierophany, which is the manifestation of the sacred within mundane life, because it's definitely not something that humanity encounters on a day-to-day basis as established in both of the worlds. And sort of that consistent response by humanity, as a reference to Rudolf Otto, with the response of like fear and awe. And with E.T., his death and rebirth with like flatlining and then coming alive again when Elliot speaks to him, he sort of, that facilitates his ability to return home and escape from humanity, because Elliot is able to get him out from the facility and sort of outsmart the scientists who were going to take him in and sort of dissect him. And, you know, throughout the film, we see these embodiments of the other constantly being like, humanity just being in awe of them. And I think it's interesting that the questions it asks about, well, this might be completely foreign to us, but what does this other thing tell us about what makes us human? I think both of the films have different interpretations of that, but it's both definitely a lot to think about.